Hello, and welcome to another exciting ISACA podcast. As usual, my name is Chris McGowan. Joining me today is Ray Payano. He recently authored an article titled Using Risk-Based Approach to Prioritize Vulnerability Remediation. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Ray, before we jump into your article and vulnerability management risk-based approach to it, would you mind telling myself and our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So I've been in IT for over 25 years, focusing on cybersecurity for the last 14 to 15 years. I started out as a database programmer and moved through the progression of a database programmer, database administrator, database engineer. Uh, but I've always had a passion for security. Once I became a little bit tired of database, the database area, I decided to go and start focusing more on information security and cybersecurity. I've worked in multiple industries. I've worked in the sports entertainment industry. I've worked in healthcare industry, worked in the financial industry, and also the fashion industry over my career. Personally, I am originally from New York City, but I now make my home in sunny DeLand, Florida. And I have a wife and two kids. And I just found out that I am going to be a grandpa. So I'm very excited about that.
Wow, congratulations. I just became a grandpa 4 days ago,
Oh,
actually.
congratulations.
Yeah, it's exciting. So I have to ask, you mentioned entertainment industry and fashion industry. You mind telling us what you did during that
Sure,
time?
sure. So I worked at Madison Square Garden,
Oh, wow.
uh, right back in the early '90s. It's a weird thing because I started out in hospitality there and kind of evolved a little bit into their pseudo tech support for their POS system. It was kind of my secondary job, that the tech support. And then with the fashion, I was a point of sale engineer for Louis Vuitton. So the LVMH fashion group, Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, which has a lot of brands under it. But that's I was point of sale support for their systems there for 2-3 years.
Wow. Did you get free tickets at Madison Square Garden?
Oh, we had backstage. We had total
Oh,
access to backstage. So I saw all the backstage shows and uh, saw some things that probably normal people shouldn't see. Let's just put it that way.
I'm sure. So jumping into your article content, risk-based approach to vulnerabilities management. Why do you think that it's important to have a risk-based approach to it?
It's important because it's critical for an organization to understand what the risk is when things are not working correctly, or when systems are vulnerable to malicious actors. All right, vulnerability management has exploded over the many years because just the sheer number of systems that organizations have implemented, the sheer number of software that's out there, and unfortunately, when it comes to software and systems, there are flaws, flaws and vulnerabilities that occur with that occur with those systems. All right. And it's very challenging for organizations to understand, or to be able to remediate those flaws and and those vulnerabilities without understanding what the risk to the organization is.
Yeah, that's similar. Like, you use a scanner or whatever tool you're going to use that might be off the shelf or tweaked a little bit for whatever your organization is. They're not really adequate enough to give you that risk side of it, are they?
No, they're not, and they're not really built for that. I mean, they're built to, you feed them a set of IP addresses. They go out, they scan the environment, find what they need, and report back. But they don't. those scanners don't have the visibility as to what your organization, what your primary focus of the organization. So, in other words, what industry you're in, what your primary focuses are, what your your asset criticality. How important your assets are. So you could have a tiering level. These systems and applications are your tier one. Then you can go down the line, tier two, tier three, tier four. Those scanners really don't have that kind of visibility to understand, okay, how important those assets are. So while the vulnerability scanners tell you, okay, what's out there, or what needs to be remediated, it's up to the organization to apply logic and apply, as I say, risk calculations to determine how to remediate and which systems to remediate first.
So do you think that the, do you think a lot of companies are using risk-based approach, or is it a new thing? Um,
They Organizations that I have witnessed, organizations have started looking at a risk-based approach because of the challenges that I put forward in my article. So you have the increased number of vulnerabilities, which has grown exponentially over time. Okay, we don't have the final numbers for 2023 yet, but for the first 4 months of 2023, we're already on pace to be higher than 2022 on published vulnerabilities. All right. Then you have the issue with resources. You have the issue with downtime. So as organizations and companies are coming onto the web over the last 10, 15 years. Okay, almost every organization that you can think of is 24/7. So taking down servers for maintenance, all right, causes interruption in the business. So with those challenges, okay, it's very important for organizations to really look at their remediation and say, okay, what can we remediate? What should we remediate first? All right, and then work towards the backlog, or work towards the remediation timeline, to be able to get everything remediated, and a risk-based approach helps them with that exercise.
that's where the term, what is it, asset criticality? That's kind of
Correct.
where that comes into play, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
So
for so if you think about, I'm sorry, if you think about
no,
asset criticality, is you may have 5 or 6 systems that are vulnerable to the same flaw. Okay, let's take Log4j. Everybody knows about Log4j. Yeah, even out of the industry, everybody knows about Log4j. So, but let's say you have six systems that are vulnerable to Log4j. All right, but 4 of those systems are very low criticality. In other words, they're a tier 4 application. They're not mission critical or business critical. They're not customer facing, and so on. So you might delay the remediation for those while you have the other two, okay, that are internet facing, customer facing, directly affects your bottom line. If those systems go down, or these systems are compromised, could do major damage to the organization. You're going to prioritize those 2 systems before you tackle the other 4 systems.
and that also works in reverse, right? Like if, say, it comes back saying it's a low priority vulnerability or low level prior vulnerability, but it could be the system itself might be a higher criticality. So you would have to almost bump it up, and just because something comes in green or yellow and it's not red, you might have to prioritize it depending on the risk, right?
Right, absolutely. Right. Because again, your scanners don't have that visibility as to what's critical in your organization. And that's why I always discuss when I discuss this topic, I always talk about the temporal and environmental metrics, okay, of your common vulnerability exposures, or or published CVEs. So most scanners will give you a CVE score that's just your standard score. All right. And they might give you some temporal information as far as Is that vulnerability being exploited out in the wild? Are proof of concept have proof of concepts of compromise been detected? They'll give you that information, but what information the scanner doesn't have, okay, is that environmental metrics. So what systems, okay, the systems that are affected by the vulnerability, what do they do? What is their function? What is their effect on the business? So what is their function in the business? What is their effect on the business? And what would happen if that system would be compromised?
So it's basically very critical to for whatever organization, depending on size, it doesn't really matter, on understanding what assets they have and where they fall in that criticality.
Absolutely, and even today, there are a lot of organizations out there that are still struggling just with their overall asset management. All right. And you look at any one of your standard frameworks out there. If you look at your NIST, you look at in healthcare, you look at your high trust in banking or finance, you look at your FFIEC. There's always that fundamental item that exists in all of them. Asset management, knowing what your assets are. All right. If you don't know what assets you have, if you don't know what's been deployed in your organization, okay, it's very, very difficult to be able to manage them and protect them effectively. All right. So with the risk-based approach, you take that to the next level. Okay, let's say you do know all your assets. Now you need to determine how important is that asset to your organization. Okay. And then you also have to have asset dependency. So, for example, if server A is compromised, how will that affect server B? Or if application A is compromised, can that have a downstream effect to your other applications? So you have that's taking asset management to the next level and applying that criticality value.
I think that's extremely important. I mean, you got to know what you have to be able to protect it in all aspects of securing whatever your organization has. So I know there's quite a bit, and we touched on it briefly, that quite a bit of backlog of vulnerability when it comes to vulnerability management because of remote work, bring your devices to work. The more technology gets developed, gets added to whatever network or whatever. Is that what's really causing the backlog, do you think?
That is part of it, but for me, the backlog is again the number of vulnerabilities that have been published over the years. Okay, starting in 2017, the amount of vulnerabilities has just kept going and kept rising, keep getting higher. All right. That's part of it. Part of it is the lack of resources, all right, to be able um, to remediate vulnerabilities in a timely manner. And I'm talking about not just lack of resources, having a lean teams, but also individuals having the cybersecurity knowledge, all right, to be able to understand what the vulnerabilities are, how to remediate them, and so on. We all know that there is a shortage of qualified cybersecurity practitioners in the world today. The number that I cited was something like 3 million jobs, I believe, that are open out there. I know it's constantly changing, so that's part of it as well. And also, I'm always going to go back to that downtime. All right, nobody wants downtime. You know, Everybody wants, 4 nines or 5 nines of uptime. But if you're going to really remediate vulnerabilities, you got to take some downtime to be able to get those systems patched. And then that also brings in, well, then you can do high availability, you could do failover, all right. But now that brings into it financial uh, decisions that have to be made. All right, a lot of these things that can be done to reduce some of these items some of these challenges are going are, are expensive. They're going to cost money to be able to implement them.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of I mean, in my experience, a lot of organizations that I've worked for, they see those big CVEs or those big vulnerabilities, the big ones, that make all the noise, and that's what they prioritize. And I use the terms, green, yellow, red when it comes to grading of a vulnerability, not using a risk-based approach, just vulnerability management in general. And some organizations that I've worked for before, if it's not in the high yellow, you don't worry about it. Not even looking at it. And I would always preach to, people above me is like, I get it's going to take more manpower to do it, but like we spoke about before, you might not realize it's a green on what shows on the scanner or whatever product you're using, but if say, it got hacked or something bad happened, it could actually cause more problems than some of the yellow or reds. And a lot of the times it wasn't a money per se. Well, manning is money, but a lot of times we don't have the people to throw at it. So just don't worry about it.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, but I mean, it's not taking a risk-based approach. That's more like, let's deal with the blaring alarms rather than a holistic approach to vulnerability management in general. And I think I told you when we talked before the podcast started, my wife works for a company and she does vulnerability management. And not to be specific, but she's been flabbergasted with different organizations that have that backlog. And it's not just 50, 60 vulnerabilities. I mean, it's thousands and thousands of. I mean, it's the numbers like exponential, and it's just crazy to think how much that's going to grow. Year after year after year.
It's right. It's going to continue to grow year after year after year, especially when, again, the number of the number of flaws or the number of vulnerabilities that are discovered just keeps growing. Okay, and I don't think that's ever going to change. Okay, software companies especially. Okay, their model is product to market. So they're going to push that product to market. All right, and if vulnerability comes in, then we'll take care of it, after the fact. Okay, so as they're pushing that product to market, okay, if they're not doing their due diligence, then there are going to be more vulnerabilities and more flaws introduced into the industries.
I remember, when the new operating system came out, new version, doesn't really, I'm not going to name which ones, but just a new version of anything, even for your cell phones. I always hated it having, the experience I have, like, oh, great, it's going to break stuff, as soon as you update an iOS or an operating system. And that's what it does. And after, we'll just report, the vulnerabilities or whatever. And you find there's holes throughout anything because, like you said, product to market. And it's just, from a security standpoint, it always blew my mind. The average person's just like, oh, well, they'll fix it. Not knowing, this could be detrimental to your privacy / whatever. It's crazy.
Right.
So how exactly, I mean, did we really touch on it? I mean, the actual calculating that vulnerability risk.
So there's a lot of different ways. I don't like to give organizations or anyone that reads my article like an exact calculation, because it all really depends on their organization. What I try to provide is a guideline. All right, these are the things that you want to look at. I mean, you can take your standard, risk grid, okay, quantitative risk grid, and a low is 0 to 3 is a low, 4 to 6 is a moderate, 7 to 10 is a high, and above 10 is critical, or maybe your 10 is critical. But then you can use those numbers to determine what your calculation is. All right. And then different organizations might show their asset criticality or their asset severity differently. They might, display it as tiers. So tier one asset to tier 4, tier 5. They can say level 1 to 4. I worked with an organization that their most critical assets were level 4 and went down, level 3, level 2, level 1. So there's different ways that they can do it. I always say it's better for the organization to decide how they're going to calculate. okay, and how they're going to display that information. But they need to take in what they need to take into account in the calculation is, of course, the CVE score, take into account the temporal and the environmental metrics that we discussed earlier, take into account the asset criticality, and one thing that we haven't discussed is the strength of controls already in place. Okay, so one of the things that can also affect your a risk score for a vulnerability is, well, what controls do you have in place? Okay, for that might reduce the risk, okay, of that vulnerability. Okay, and the risks, as I laid out in the article, you let's consider the following scenario. Right, we have a vulnerabilities discovered in an asset that is rated as a very high or critical based on the scanner. But you look at it and say, okay, the information is not public internet facing, does not contain sensitive information. Okay, you have MFA in place to be able to access that system. Audit logging and monitoring are implemented. Okay, and there's a low to very low business impact if the system is not available. So with all those factors, you can say, okay, so it's a very high, but with all those mitigating controls, and the things that are in place, we can probably downgrade that from a very high to, let's say, a moderate. All right, and then that can take, that can be put to the side for a little bit, not forever. That can be put over to the side while you tackle your very high or your critical vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's a very important point to make. I mean, I think that you'd hope that most organizations already do some form of this, but as we know, it's not the case all the time. So Ray, before we come to a close today, sadly, is there any last things you want to share with our audience today?
The only thing would like to share, what I would like to share with everyone is, understand and make sure that your organization understands, okay, risk in general. Okay, sometimes risk is looked at as, a, a necessary evil because, your legal and regulatory requirements require you to measure risk. Frameworks talk about risk, but they really don't take it, that they really don't look into it, okay, deep as they should. Okay, from a cybersecurity risk perspective, you've got to look at everything in the environment that can cause harm to the organization. Now, when I say that, is marrying that cybersecurity risk from a technical perspective to your enterprise risk management from a business perspective. So, a lot of cybersecurity risk practitioners will look at, say, okay, the risk of a vulnerability is high, or the risk of this port being opened is high. Okay, and then just leave it at that. Okay, no. If there is a vulnerability or there's a finding, all right, how is that going to affect the organization? And not just from a technical perspective, saying, yeah, it can be the asset can be compromised, data can be stolen. You got to take it to the next level. Okay, if the data is stolen, okay, or if that system is compromised, how is that going to affect the organization from a legal perspective, compliance perspective, financial perspective, reputation perspective? Okay, you got to put on that lens and understand how what the cybersecurity risk, how that can affect your overall enterprise business risk. Because once you're talking about risk to your C level and to the board and so on, okay, all they want to know is, how is this issue, or how is this vulnerability, or how is this finding going to affect me from a business perspective? What do I have to worry about? Okay. All right. And as you've seen, from the fallout of a lot of the breaches that have happened in the years, who are the ones that get affected first? C level and executives. Those are the first ones that go out the door. Okay. So from a business level perspective, they understand that there's risk, but you need to be able to tie in that cyber risk, the cybersecurity risk, okay, to the risk that they're talking about or the risk that they're worried about.
Yeah, Ray. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there. We have all these fancy tools and the frameworks are all great things, but they're just what it is. It's a framework. You have to have that human connection to be able to take information and then cross it over, like you said, into how does that affect what. I think that's a piece. A lot of people that do remediation, vulnerability management, remediation stuff. I think some people miss that because, like you said, I mean, when you report it up, they don't really care about graphs and fancy numbers. They want to know okay, what's that going to affect? What's that going to do, right?
And that's one of the things when I went to school, um, full transparency, I dropped out. I dropped out when I first went to college. Then I went back and got an associate's degree just to get into the industry. When I decided to go back and get my bachelor's degree, all right, I didn't get a computer science degree. I didn't get an information security and cybersecurity degree. I got a management degree, a business management. So business administration, business management degree. Why? Because I realized that I needed, if I'm going to be effective as a cybersecurity practitioner, okay, I need to understand how business works. I need to understand how the business world works and what those, C-level executives and the board of directors, what they're looking for when it comes to reporting up. All right. Yes, the graphs are nice. All right, but you have to put it for them in plain English so they understand.
Yes, I agree 100%. Most of my career was in government work, and then moving over, to this side of the house, that was a learning curve in the beginning because my mindset was a certain way. But then I'm like, wait a minute, I'm missing like a big picture here. And then, like I always close most of my podcast, stating I learned something every podcast. That's why I think this kind of thing is very important. And I hope that people take away from this, the importance of the content of what we've been talking about. So Ray, if you don't have anything else, I just want to say thank you very much. I've enjoyed the content. I really enjoyed the article. And if anybody's interested in reading the article, there'll be a link in the description of this podcast. I highly suggest you do. So to everybody out there, just keep learning and keep doing what we do. Thank you.